Hello, everyone, and welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, and I'm here with my co-host, Alan Reinach, who is president and general counsel for the Church State Council. So, Alan, we have been embarked on this project of trying to reclaim religious liberty from the political extremes. And our guest today is really talking about political extremes. We're going to be talking with an author who has tackled a subject that is, I think it's misunderstood. It can be used in ways which it's not intended, and that is the idea of Seven Mountains Mandate and the way that Christians are called or not to be involved in the public space. Alan, I think this is going to be a challenging interview, so why don't you get us started?
Our guest today is Matthew Boedy, professor of rhetoric at the University of North Georgia, and he published a book recently entitled The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. Well, Professor Boedy, we're delighted to have you with us. I think most Americans would reject the idea of destroying democracy, but many American Christians, anyway, think that, America's gone way too far off the deep end, on the left, and we need to Christianize the country far more. And bring Christ and bring religion back to America, and resonate when our president says, we're going to bring back religion and bring back God into America. That's certainly the kind of cultural divide that we live in. But I find, at least in our own Seventh-day Adventist churches, people do have no idea what the Seven Mountain Mandate is. So why don't we start there and tell us what that is, and kind of, what's its sort of a theological heritage? Where does it come from?
Yeah, so the seven mountains are mountains as a metaphor for the seven cultural institutions, and I always leave one off when I list them, but business, education, government, religion, media, entertainment, family, is that all seven? But if you think about the institutions that make our culture, these are the seven mountains. And this list of seven was invented, come up by two college campus ministry founders in the 70s, Bill Bright with Campus Crusade and a guy named Lauren Cunningham, who ran an organization called Youth with a Mission, which was a global youth mission organization. And really, they wanted to do exactly what you said or described in your introduction, was to have their alumni, their Christians that they discipled on campus, go and influence and be Christians in these areas. We might use the metaphor of salt and light. We might use other descriptions that we normally use about how Christians would influence society. And I want to emphasize that word influence, because over the years, this list, they called it seven spheres of culture, changed into a mandate. And we saw that change right around the turn of the century, in the year 2000, when spiritual warfare rhetoric really picked up in charismatic circles. And they changed the list into a mandate, that is a mandate to take back America. And if you think about the ways in which they're going to take back the culture, it is not just the government. You think about the government being one of the mountains, electing people to high office who are Christians, and that's all well and good. But in some manners, they're getting around the traditional separation of church and state by saying, well, we're just going to take the whole culture. Now, there's different ways in which they plan to do that. Electing people is one of them, kind of not just promoting their ideas of the traditional family, but mocking and silencing other voices, and particular examples of taking the fight to them so they won't speak out against their own views. That's a different kind of tact than I might describe what Bill Bright does or did with Campus Crusade. So the theological origins are in the 70s, when people thought, of course, we lost the culture to the 60s. But I think as conservative Christians got involved in politics, they started to find ways and get to involve in several of those mountains, education being one of them. Over the years, though, and I say this with no negativity, the constant losing of the culture made them turn up, raise the stakes of this mandate, so that by the time Donald Trump comes onto the scene in 2015 or 2016, he has a collection of evangelical advisors that are steeped in this. Paula White Cain, one of his central advisors, is steeped in this. There's other people that do that. And my book targets or focuses on Charlie Kirk, who was the president and founder of Turning Point USA. And I suggest he is the third generation. He's the heir to the Seven Mountains Mandate. And he has made Turning Point into the indispensable organization for the Seven Mountains Mandate, that there's an arm of Turning Point for each of the seven. And he changed the mission statement, if you will, of Turning Point from being sort of a capitalist, free market, anti-higher education, conservative student organization into an organization that wants to win the culture war. And their picture of victory is taking back these seven mountains. So that's a short history of the mountains. It is about Christians in society in these different areas, but it is also a kind of battle they see that they must win, and particularly to advance not just the kingdom, but to bring on their victorious picture of the end times. That is, it's not about Christian persecution in the end. It is about Jesus returning to a nation that has been built up in a Christian way for him.
I want to drill down on sort of the whole premise of what you've just spoken about here, and that is the issue of the line between Christians being salt and light, which is a biblical mandate to influence society in a way that comports with their beliefs, and what you're talking about, which is an entirely different thing. Again, I talk about Christian nationalism in different venues, and I often get pushback on that point. How can you say that I am not called to step into the public space with my faith and display those virtues and values? So how does one make that distinction?
I think a good example of this, and as a Christian, I would agree with everything you just said there. I think a good example is what we've seen in the weeks after Charlie Kirk's assassination. There was a social media post yesterday by a country music artist named Cole Swindell. And he described in ways in which the death of Kirk had impacted him. He wasn't just going to write songs about faith. He was going to speak more about his faith. Particularly, he said, though, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something, I'm not a judgmental person. I'm a good person. I want to help out people. I want to do good in society. And then, quote, but that's not enough anymore. And I want to emphasize that what we traditionally think of Christianity in society, helping the poor, changing the communities, getting people out of poverty, changing people out of addiction, that's not enough anymore to the Seven Mountains Mandate people. That is, it is, you want to call it a gospel plus religion. It is about taking the gospel, and particularly, they're not interested in, when I say they want to Christianize America, it is not necessarily about having the majority of people identify as Christians, that is converted to that. They're a minority movement on purpose because they want their minority to rule over the majority, and that's why I suggest it's anti-democratic. So the line between, if you will, gospel living and redeeming the society individually is moved into a perhaps institutional redemption. As they think that people who have followed the Seven Mountains Mandate think that reformation comes before revival. So we think of Christianity as a revival religion, persuading people to become Christ and then live out their Christianity. They want to start at the top with the institutions and reform those institutions, and that will, in some manners, create revival, maybe turn people to Christ. And I think that's the line you're trying to describe there.
Oh my head is bursting with different directions to go in. But let's start with this focus on, reforming the institution. Where I'm going in my head is in Revelation 13, the final apostasy that Christians are familiar with the imagery of the mark of the beast. The language there is that everyone is being compelled to, quote, worship the beast. And in traditional Protestant interpretation, a beast is a symbol for a nation or an empire. And, what I see in this movement, and you tell me if this is, consistent with what you're seeing, is instead of the focus being on individual salvation through the grace and sacrifice of Christ, it's really on, kind of focusing on the worship of the beast, the focus on the nation, as it were, on taking over the nation for Christ, on redeeming the nation, even on a type of salvation of the nation.
Yeah.
Is that
No,
a
yes.
fair description?
Yeah, that's the language they use when they talk about, I think, the end of Matthew, and then we should go disciple the nations. They see that as nations, not individual people in nations. And you think about the mark of the beast and the nation throughout that on the last 50 years of the nations that have been identified as that, China and Russia and Persia and all these things. And now they're saying no matter who the Antichrist turns out to be, we're going to have a bulwark here in America as a Christian nation. And I think it fundamentally changes how we view what you kind of described, is that Christians in the end will be persecuted or forced to believe things. And they're saying, well, no, we can be victorious if we build up this Christian nation, no matter how many people in the nation itself are Christian.
You mentioned earlier, Matthew, that this movement really started to change and to expand around the turn of the century, which was also coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, when social media and the internet really started to. So how far is this movement fueled by social media? How far is its influence amplified by social media?
I think early on, and there's been a couple of books written about this group called the New Apostolic Reformation, led by Peter Wagner. That was a collection, a network of apostles and prophets before the internet happened. And because they had that network already created when social media came around, it was very much easier to make that network on the internet. But also, I think that with Turning Point being the third generation, the heir to this movement, they've been very good since they started in 2012 of being on social media and creating relationships and community and hashtags and memes and all the things you can think about now with social media, because it allows it to spread much more widely. But also, I think that it allows it to spread in a particular rhetorical way, that it because there's not a lot of room on social media and it's very quick, hot takes, they often create bumper sticker mottos, like, again, the idea that Charlie Kirk was before: faith, freedom, and family. And that is certainly 3 of the 7 mountains. And what I'm getting at is that the way in which it has spread, it spreads thin. So people who believe in Christian nationalism kind of believe in 1 or 2 of the elements, but they don't know that they believe in the 7 mountains, or they believe that we should have a Christian culture, but they don't believe that it came or know that it came from the 7 mountains. So the spreading of social media has I don't want to say dumbed down, but it has thinned it out so that we don't get the type of thinking about it that we would if we didn't have it.
Right.
So I want to come back to another theme that you touched on earlier, which is spiritual warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember attending something probably around the turn of the century at the convention center in Los Angeles. And there was, tremendous the kind of emphasis on a type of spiritual warfare of prayer walking, of casting demons out of neighborhoods.
Yep, I write about that.
And what we see now, I mean, in our politics, you see rhetoric that literally demonizes the other political party and insists that they're being controlled by demons. And if you're not with us, then we need to literally cast Satan out of you. Talk about, the extent to which spiritual warfare has maybe contributed to the polarization in our society.
Yesterday at the Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony, President Trump said that the left, or the radical left, or I forget what phrase he used, but that was the devil's ideology. And that is the prime example of the way in which spiritual warfare has reached the White House. I think that all the things you just described were happening around in the 90s and the early 2000s. They were taking back our cities, and there's particular books that I write about that give the idea that within the city, these spheres or these cultural institutions were taken over by demons, and the people would literally walk the streets and cast them out. And, you might think of that as fringe theology now, but now it's become nationalized. We're not just talking about individual neighborhoods or cities or perhaps churches influencing their community. We're talking about a national spiritual warfare. And that's exactly what I think that Donald Trump brought to politics, was taking this spiritual warfare and politicizing it. If you think about spiritual warfare, it's about prayer. It's about, really getting on your knees and saying, please be gone. But at the same time, it can be translated easily into action. So the divide between good and evil spirits in a city and the divide between good and evil politics, there was not a far jump from that. And so with the Seven Mountains mandate, is particularly, I think, with Turning Point and Charlie Kirk, is that they force people to make these decisions. They have made politics the dividing line. You are for us or you're against us. And this translates or came directly from Scripture, right? Either you're against Christ or for Christ. And so they've taken spiritual language and politicized it. If you want to call it weaponized it, that's fine. But have made it so that evangelicals and conservative Christians can easily take their spiritual language and put it into politics. And back to your original question, why wouldn't they want to do that? Well, this is a prime example of why they would not want to do that, because you're taking the other side and saying there's no compromise with evil. And if the basis of our democracy is compromised, then you have just blown up that basis.
I'm listening to you talk, and it seems to me that neither side, left or right, has clean hands on demonizing each other. There is a sense among some Christians, rightly or wrongly, that they are sort of a beleaguered group in American society for different reasons, that they have been, that they are cast as outside of mainstream culture. Help us understand why what you're talking about is not hostile to Christianity. Help us understand why embracing the idea of effective church-state separation is not an idea that is hostile to Christianity.
I think it depends, or it rests on what you see as the value or the end of Christianity. If you think about Christianity as a religion of weakness, as a religion of the cross, that you are not necessarily going to win the earth. You're going to win in heaven. So the separation of church and state allows that religion to blossom, or really any religion to blossom, to be free from imposition from the government to tell it what to do, but also to be free from that idea that it could run the government. I go back to Constantine and the mythical story of him seeing the sun in the sky and then making the Roman Empire Christian. That set off a series of events that changed what we think of Christianity. Could it be a religion of power or a religion of weakness? And I think specifically the people in the Seven Mountains Mandate take that question and say, what is wrong with being a religion of power? Why should we not turn the other cheek? Or how could we change kingdom living as sort of this spiritual, implicit, do your own business and let God take care of the rest, to no, we should do more than that. And I think it's always the more than that encroaches upon the separation of church and state. The people that advocate for the Seven Mountains Mandate think they have lost and they are tired of losing. And they want to take back the culture. And yes, you're right. The basis of the Seven Mountains Mandate is this persecution of Christians. That not only have they lost in the culture, they've lost percentage-wise in terms of believers. And this is why it's a minority movement on purpose. And they have made that minority into a positive for their movement.
So when, the origins of the modern religious right, going back to the mid to late 70s, and the creation of the moral majority and the Christian coalition and such, during the Reagan years, leaders from the right may have had, quote, a seat at the table. They may have had an invite to the White House, but they really didn't accomplish much of their goals or agenda. And they didn't have kind of the backbench, if you will, the um, the cadre of educated professionals that could take the positions of leadership, not just like in, say, cabinet level, but within various government agencies and what have you. Fast forward now, um, 30, 40 years. And we have all of these institutions. You mentioned Campus Crusade for Christ or Youth with a Mission, but, you have both Falwell and Robertson creating very significant academic institutions that have been training generations of college students, graduate students, professionals with, a worldview that is, hey, we Christians need to see that our values prevail broadly within society. Talk about really where we're at in this sort of swing of things. How much power and influence have those with this sort of seven mountain mandate worldview? How much power and influence have they obtained at this point?
Um, I do think some of the groups you mentioned over the time, right, have tried one or two of the mountains at a time. Government and education, you kind of emphasized. And at times we've moved into the more media entertainment realms, but it's really been kind of a parallel track. We're going to create a Christian culture and we're going to have this other culture over there, and we're going to win in the marketplace. And I think that what's changed with the Seven Mountains Mandate is they don't want to compete so much in the marketplace. They want to, run the marketplace. And I think that long-term plan you just described about putting people in education institutions and giving them generational growth toward government has paid off, right? We've seen that in Supreme Court justices and law clerks and on down the line, and they've had significant victories in those arenas, in the two Donald Trump administrations. So I suggest that Turning Point, because of its youth, because of its leader who is a millennial, and because of the millions of dollars it has, it's brought the Seven Mountains Mandate as close to success as it's ever been. Now, if you think about the Seven Mountains, what do they own right now? They certainly have overtaken the mountain of government. The other ones are still up for grabs. I do think they're making a lot of inroads in the mountain of education, and not just with the voucher system and that, but also Christianizing public schools. I think also with the mountain of religion, you think, I when I heard first the Seven Mountains, it was like they already own the mountain of religion, like the church. It's not run by demons, but they think that it is, right? That there are coward pastors out there who are not speaking politically. I think Turning Point itself has made inroads into particular denominations. It's certainly still a minority movement within Christianity, and certainly I think still within conservative Christianity. But I do think that one of the things that makes me think it's a threat to democracy is they use democratic levers or levers of power or democratic actions to get elected or to find democratic power. And then once they're there, they impose the other mountains on the rest of us through perhaps legal, perhaps not, ways. And I think that if we see over time, once they have this power over time, they may get the rest of the mountains. And this is why I think Turning Point's built to last. They have taken all seven, or they're going after all seven at once, and that makes them pretty powerful.
As I've been listening to you speak, it strikes me that Seven Mountains Mandate and those who are pursuing those ideas, their understanding of America itself is it's a unique understanding. Yes. And it's an understanding that encompasses history, a very particular understanding of the history of our nation, and a very particular understanding of eschatology, the future of our nation. Can you I know you've already touched on it, but can you describe that sort of historical revisionism that fuels this understanding of what America is and what it's meant to be?
Right. So, I mean, think about Christian nationalism. One part of that is that you believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, specifically that the founding fathers were Bible believing Christians, all of them, and that there was a significant segment of the population that not was just Christian, but there were pastoral leaders that fought and led the revolution. There's this mythical idea that David Barton, one of the historians that the Seven Mountains people turn to, is about this
Don't
black
call him a historian,
yeah,
please.
yeah, quotations on historic. This black robe regiment of pastors that led the revolution. So there are particular historical myths that they go to. Again, the Bible believing Christian signers of the Declaration of Independence. But also, if you think about the founding of the nation as a Christian nation, this is where the First Amendment comes into play. They believe, and Charlie Kirk has said this specifically, that the founders saw the First Amendment as certainly a separation of church and state, but it was only a separation of Protestant sects, as the government would not pick winners in between Protestantism. So the government itself would be a consensus Protestant government, but they would not decide in between sects. And also, there was no freedom of religion at the state level. They all point to that God is mentioned in all the constitutions of the states. So that historical revisionism, but also historical truth at times, allows them to say, we've been a Christian nation, and at some point we lost that. And then, of course, the future is what a Christian nation looks like in the future is not necessarily the majority of people being Christian, but returning to this consensus that they saw in history. And that consensus is really the driving force of this mandate, because that's kind of the vague picture of victory. What does it look like that the Seven Mountains gets what they want? Well, it's this Christian consensus culture. And I think that the ideas of both history and the future impact the present in this way.
So, Matthew, this has just been a fascinating conversation, and I've learned a lot. But I'm wondering whether you can leave us with some words about how an average listener who's hearing this and thinking that kind of sounds like ideas that I've been hearing, not packaged as a Seven Mountains mandate, but maybe just ideas that are out there on social media. How can listeners who are concerned about church-state separation immunize themselves against getting caught up with this type of thinking?
One, I do think there are several groups that identify themselves as Christians, specifically a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And I did an interview with Americans United for Church and State, which have a lot of religious members in it. So there are two groups that often do a lot of work in this area. But also, I think that if you're seeing things on social media that you're not sure are Christian nationalism, because to be honest with you, people who follow that ideology don't identify themselves as that. In fact, they don't like that term. One, you do need to ask them about where they see the origins of America. And that question that you asked is very important. Do they then start giving us historical myths that happened? And then two, I think that one, I always ask where people spend their money. What organizations do they donate to? Where do they give their time? And you could probably identify pretty quickly, what organizations are Christian nationalism or, Seven Mountains mandate is a term that even Charlie Kirk doesn't use, even though he is promoting it. So you really have to dig deeper into perhaps the people they're quoting and the types of words that they're using and where they're getting them from. That's a lot of work. I totally agree with that. At the same time, if you want to promote Christianity in your community and work with people who are with this, you need to find out how far they're willing to go or not go with your efforts.
So, Alan, what did you think?
Well, certainly there's a lot of what he was sharing that, you and I have discussed before, that we have understood. I think this understanding of the Seven Mountain Mandate and how polarizing and undemocratic it is, I think that's really important information for people to have, right? There's a big
Yeah.
difference between being salt and light and being a witness for Christian faith and Christian lifestyle, and then using that as a vehicle for power, right? Whether it's power in media, power in education, power in government, I think that's a real violation of gospel principles. Jesus said, he who would be great among you be as a servant, not be as a ruler. So I think it's just, the complete antithesis of the Christian message to be seeking power over all of this.
So, Alan, here's where I have perhaps some difficulty when we're talking about this subject. You know full well that I'm 110% on board with everything that you just said. Liberty Magazine itself, for the past 120 years, has been talking about how Christianity is not about political power. It's about Christ's power. It's about the kingdom to come, not of this world. But for one reason or another, when we talk about Christian nationalism, when we talk about separation of church and state, there's strands of thought and perspective that is inherently hostile toward Christianity today. I mean, I would say separation of church and state protects and preserves Christianity, but some are using the language of that to attack Christianity. I don't know. Am I getting this out of perspective, Alan?
Well, you're not, but there's. Let me kind of give a little history lesson here. In the late 1940s, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was at the heart of establishing an organization called Americans United for Separation of Church and State. But in the early 90s, that organization took a distinct turn towards establishing itself as being against the religious right. And in so doing, it really publicly, reached out for the support of those who are hostile to Christianity, and the Adventist Church was forced to part company. And I started my career, I was, right about that time. So that's kind of the most prominent organization. Now, with any organization, left, right, or center, we're on the same page on some issues and not on the same page on other issues. So I'm not trying to, issue a blanket assessment of Americans United by any stretch, but there certainly are, those on the secular left that are hostile and drive the polarization from their point of view. Of course, as I've often said and often been quoted, we Seventh-day Adventists are in what I call the lonely middle, because neither are we the religious right or the Christian nationalists, but neither are we the secular left. We're profoundly Protestant, Bible-based church. But we also, as a minority, we know that majoritarian religion is oppressive, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of what religious tradition it is, whether it's, Islam in Iran, or Hinduism in India, or Orthodoxy in some Orthodox countries, and Christianity has a very bad history of its behavior when it becomes a majoritarian religion in political power. And I don't think that's should be seen as a negative on Bible Christianity, but it is a negative on, the merger of Christian faith and political power. And so I think that, the message for us, for whom Christ and the Bible are so centrally important, is to really focus on how do we represent Christ in the world, not by seeking power, but by representing the principle of love and compassion and kindness that's central to the very character of God. So on that note, we're going to call us to a close and remind our listeners this has been Just Liberty. I'm Alan Reinach with my co-host Bettina Krause. And remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.